Here's a question that you don't have to answer out loud. When you heard this gospel, did you think to yourself, I hope so-and-so is paying attention to this gospel because they really need to hear it? I have to admit that I have had that thought before. I'm not happy about that, but I've had that thought before. Perhaps we quickly identify someone we know with the judgmental Pharisee. But doing so, of course, misses the whole point of this gospel. In fact, it's doing exactly what the gospel warns us about. The gospel challenges us not to focus on what anyone else might be doing wrong, but rather to take a good, hard look at ourselves. But it's so much easier to notice the faults of others, isn't it? And why is that? Perhaps it's because we aren't comfortable recognizing our own faults and weaknesses. In seminary, we often heard about something called fraternal correction, letting one of our seminarian brothers know when he had stepped out of line. And it was easier to do than to be on the receiving end of, though. When someone criticizes us or even gently points out something that we need to work on, we can quickly become defensive. And yet it's easy to formulate in our own minds exactly what the faults of someone else are and what he or she needs to do to correct them. And it's also easier to make these snap judgments of other people, or sometimes even well thought out, long considered and ruminated over judgments, because we don't know the thought processes that have gone through their minds that have led them to choose a particular course of action. Nor do we know the background story, what may have influenced a person to act the way he did. We're much more aware of our own thought processes, our own background, the things that have influenced us, and so we're more likely to give ourselves a pass. In today's gospel, Jesus presents to us two characters side by side, the Pharisee and the tax collector. And Pharisees and tax collectors, of course, make frequent appearances in the Gospels. Jesus is often at odds with the Pharisees while reaching out to tax collectors. In this parable, both men are praying in the temple, but the Pharisee isn't really doing much praying. He's really talking to himself. The Gospel says, the Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself. And then he parades before his mind all of his credentials, all the good things that he's doing. He puts himself above others, in fact, above the rest of humanity, it says, all of whom he looks down on as sinners. And he lists all of his pious works, which go above and beyond what even the Jewish law requires. And then there's the tax collector. And tax collectors, along with prostitutes, were among the most scorned people in their society. And in contrast to the prayer of the Pharisee, the tax collector actually prays to God, and his prayer is heartfelt and anguished. He doesn't seek to justify himself before the Lord. He doesn't even dare to raise his eyes to heaven. In fact, the Pharisee was right about him. The tax collector is the sinner the Pharisee identifies him as. And the tax collector knows this about himself. But unlike the Pharisee, he doesn't point the finger at anyone else. In reality, both men are sinners. Both men are in need of God's mercy. One has been dishonest and greedy, but the other one is guilty of an even more fundamental and more serious sin, the sin of pride. But only one was aware of his sinfulness, and consequently of how he needed God's mercy. And so only one, the tax collector, was justified in the sight of the Lord. In other words, it was the tax collector and not the Pharisee who was able to be forgiven. And one of the things that makes pride so deadly and harmful in our relationship with God is that it blinds us to the reality of who we are and the nature of our relationship with God. It blinds us to the things in ourselves that we need to change. It blinds us to the fact that we too are in need of God's mercy. And it prevents us from opening ourselves up to receive his mercy. And the gospel is another example of what is known as the divine reversal, the one who exalts himself will be humbled, while the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The one who has the humility to recognize his own sinfulness and need for God's mercy will be forgiven, while the one who refuses to recognize this cuts himself off from that forgiveness. And speaking of forgiveness, this month is Respect Life Month, when we pray in a particular way for greater respect for human life at all stages, from conception to natural death, and we pray for an end to abortion. And this, of course, is not to judge anyone. We can't and shouldn't judge individuals, but we can and should point out injustice and evil, and abortion is both of those things. As a society, we've become desensitized to the reality of what abortion is, that it involves a direct and intentional killing of a completely innocent human life every time. A society that permits abortion and professes to care for the poor is deceiving itself, because the unborn child is the poorest of all. And the woman who gets an abortion also becomes a victim of it and becomes impoverished by it spiritually and emotionally. It's often seen as a way to solve a perceived problem, an unexpected, unwanted pregnancy. But like all sin, it is never a solution. It only creates more problems, more pain. I have encountered many women, and yes, some men, who carry around with them so much anguish and grief from an abortion that they either had, or that they helped someone get, or that they even forced on someone. And they carry this pain around for years. It is not a solution. I want to tell them there is a chance for healing. God offers you the possibility of peace. So stop justifying it or rationalizing it in your mind. Stop blocking it out of your mind because you can't deal with it. Recognize that, like the tax collector in today's gospel, you too are in need of God's mercy. And like the tax collector, cry out to God in your heart for his mercy. God hears you, and he will forgive you. He promises this. Come to confession to receive God's forgiveness, and let him begin to heal you. This parable in today's gospel teaches all of us the importance of prayer. And for Luke, prayer is faith in action. It is not an optional exercise in piety carried out to demonstrate one's relationship with God. It is the relationship with God. The way we pray reveals the nature of that relationship. So if we don't pray, we don't have a relationship with God. This gospel teaches us two things then: that we must pray and that we must each recognize our need for God's mercy. No matter who we are, no matter what we've done, we must all be like the tax collector in this gospel. We must pray every day, and we must ask God for his forgiveness. Remember, there is no sin, however deplorable, that is greater than God's mercy. If we humble ourselves and ask for God's forgiveness, he will show us his mercy, and one day we will be exalted in God's eyes.